housekeeping items. I just want to repeat for anybody who came in not at the beginning of the last keynote that if you want to ask a question, you can just type in gtm.cnf.io. You can also upvote questions if you don't want to ask any, but you want to see what other people are asking. It's a great way to go. The Wi-Fi password is GTM 2017 exclamation point. So there's an exclamation missing on the front if you're wondering why the Wi-Fi seems broken. It is not. And with that, so here we're having a policy debate, how REV has stimulated markets and changed the role of utility in whether it has done either of those 3.5 years in. So I'm just going to go down the row here, introduce these gentlemen, and then let them all say a few words for themselves. So next to me, I have Matt Ketschke. He is a VP of Distributed Resource Integration at Con Ed. We will try not to pick on the utility too much. Live in Con Ed territory, always hard to do, but we'll go nice. And then Scott Weiner is just next to him. He's the Deputy of Markets and Innovation at New York's DPS. And then just beyond him, we have Todd Glass. He's a partner at Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, working with many of the players who are involved here in REV. And then last, certainly not least, is Jim Steffes, and he's EVP of Corporate Affairs at Direct Energy. So with that, I'll let each of you just say a few words of what you're doing up here this morning. And also, if you can comment on whether you think that REV policy and the value of distributed energy resource proceeding as it stands now is actually helping or hindering markets. I would love your opening thoughts on that.
Great. So again, I'm Matt Ketschke. My role at Con Ed is Vice President of Distributed Resource Integration. That's a role that didn't exist before REV. So thinking about how we integrate all the distributed resources coming online, both today and how we plan for them in the future, is a role that has evolved at the utility. The question on has REV animated the markets and has the recent proceedings continue to advance it? I think a number of stakeholders would be not necessarily happy with the progress we've made because they'd like to see things move very quickly. But if you take the step back and look back over the last 3.5 years from where we started to where we ended up, in that context, I think we've come pretty far. Utilities like Con Ed are now thinking about how we integrate distributed resources as part of the overall portfolio of how we solve the problem of how we deliver reliable energy to all customers. Increasingly, customers who are producing and customers consuming, and some customers who do both. So are we there yet? Definitely not. But I think if you step back and look through the perspective of 3 years worth of progress, we've made a lot of progress so far.
All right. Scott?
My name is Scott Weiner. As Kay mentioned, I am the Deputy for Markets and Innovation at DPS. You can think of it as sort of the center of gravity for REV initiatives at DPS. So the quick answer to your question is yes, but not fast enough. Certainly not fast enough to meet people's expectations. And we're finding that one of the challenges, and this is particularly evident in the VDR proceeding, is the reality of trying to work through prioritization and sequencing. Not only all stakeholders, and DPS staff are probably reaching our level of human capacity to deal with the issues before us. So one of the biggest challenges that we had to address directly and collectively is how to sequence and prioritize. In terms of impact, and I'm sure we'll get into this more, I would point to non-wires alternatives, which 3 years ago seemed like a wild, crazy idea, and now really has become the order of the day. And it's the way utilities are approaching the issue of planning throughout the state. Tied to planning, I'd point to DSIPs. The first generation of DSIPs, I think, are significant. I think we'll all agree that there's a lot of work to be done, but it's the start. And VDR has laid down the platform where, in fact, on November 1st, we will have an active tariff that begins to compensate the first round of DER in an entirely different and value-oriented way.
Great. Yeah?
Thank you. Todd Glass. I'm an energy lawyer, and our group represents on a national basis both the technology innovators as well as the new business models trying to make DERs happen all over the place. I would say from the perspective of a utility or a regulator, there's been very significant progress in development. From the perspective of an innovator, a technology developer, or anybody trying to put money to work in New York REV, it's been slow as heck, and it's frustrating. What I really worry about is we're making progress, but I don't see us getting that much closer to being able to use non-utility money or project finance, which is how the other pot of money to be able to really make distributed energy happen at a significant scale in New York State yet. I'm hopeful, but we're not there yet, and there's more work to be done.
Good. Again, my name's Jim Steffes with Direct Energy. You know, I guess I would come at this question. So Direct Energy, one of the largest energy providers in New York and across the U.S., our parent company, Centrica, serves over 30 million homes and businesses around the world with electricity and natural gas. And more, we're becoming a customer-focused energy and services company and data company and technology company. We just announced a £100 million fund that is directed at supporting innovators as they go through their journey of commercialization, and had a great conversation yesterday thanks to GTM across the street. The lens I guess I will bring is from the customer side, because everything we do is about meeting the evolving needs of our customers. And that's the lens that I would look at this, is how are customers being impacted, benefiting. You know, the first perspective I have is that, you know, someone who's been in this business over 20 years, I started back in this energy market back around the time of the Energy Policy Act of '92. And, you know, this is a transition, and it's a fundamental transition of a 100-year-old industry, of how we change things. And so in terms of changing and evolving that industry, I think we've done a pretty good job, because energy remains affordable in New York. There is more sustainable resources in New York, and the resilience and reliability of the grid continues. So I think, you know, given that we're changing a 100-year-old industry, I think we've done a pretty good job. I would just throw out that I'm not sure customers have yet been animated or engaged. And I think that's the key question as we go down the next 3 years of this journey, be it REV or all of the components of the New York energy market that are coming together. I think we have to keep thinking about how do we bring customers in. And part of that is making sure they have adequate choices, a number of choices, the right choices, and we keep evolving that so that there are real options for customers. Because each customer, I talk about this evolution in terms of 4 big Ds. Distributed, we're decentralizing, we're digitizing, we're decarbonizing. The 4th D of this transformation is design, meaning that we're no longer designing for everybody has to take the same product, but in fact we're designing for the long tail. And that's the real question as I think we go into the REV and the other elements of New York, is how do we allow each individual consumer, homes to businesses, to make the design that works for them in the collective benefit for where we want to take this industry.
Great. So I think that's a really good segue to talk a little bit about non-wires alternatives. I think this idea of bringing everyone along is important. At the same time, like, how many people really need to be brought along to get to something like a non-wires alternative? You know, like, I live in a house in Westchester, like I pay my bill. I know some of my neighbors have solar. If I talk to most people about what I was coming here to talk about for 2 days, like, nobody cares, right? Nobody cares, right? At a barbecue, at a cocktail party, how many of you sit around and talk about REV, right? Like, I always ask Richard Kaufman what he tells people at cocktail parties about this, and he's like, what? So I think, but it's really important, right? You want to have this distributed energy future. There are a lot of people that do care about options, but sort of where is that threshold? And as you design non-wires, what does that mean in terms of bringing in, you know, C&I customers, residential customers? Where is that mix? I mean, BQDM is by far the most ambitious non-wires, you know, in the country, but certainly even compared to what other New York utilities are doing. So can you talk a little bit about where that is now and where those challenges are? And, you know, critics say, well, at the end of the day, Con Ed's still just going to build that $1 billion substation. They're going to push it out, you know, however many years, and they're going to rate base this and they're going to rate base that. And, like, wasn't that a fun experiment? And so how do you move to a future where it truly is, replacing and not deferring, and how many people need to be brought along to get to that future?
So I think maybe the first question, there is an absolute range of interest in becoming a distributed resource on the part of customers, and that's a range that exists both in the commercial industrial space and in the residential space. There are absolutely prosumers in both spaces who are very interested in being very active, and then there are some who are markedly less so. When we talk about BQDM, we literally had tens of thousands of touch points with individual consumers to try to find the subset of customers who were willing to participate. In the commercial space, we have cases where maybe the optimally placed customer you can demonstrate a business model that makes sense for them to adopt DER. It just doesn't align with their overall larger business, because most DERs, whether they're commercial industrial or residential, they're not in the business of being power generators.
Right.
So this is something you have to sell as part of a overall package of benefits and why it makes sense to them. So there's going to be a range. I think over time, adoption rates or interest will increase. But you have to essentially package this in a way that it makes sense to customers and it gets in front of them.
Have you already seen some lessons learned there, and how you ran, some initial auctions, how you're looking at moving to market-based solutions versus, just sort of a set price, to how C&I DR was before?
So I think running the auction that we ran for BQDM really made a lot of sense. I think it worked well for BQDM particularly because you had a large geographic area where really a resource any place could solve the potential constraint. I think one of the big lessons learned is you need to look at the timeline that you're going to engage that resource for, because DER providers do need a degree of certainty as they look at their economics to make sure that project will work. So I think in BQDM, the early stages were too short in our timelines, and think about stretching those things out, because our real goal is essentially to eliminate the need for those stations in the longer term and those resources, not just to push them out and build them later on, but can we really eliminate the need? So longer terms is something that I think we learned out of the first phase of BQDM.
Yeah.
Catherine, could I jump in on that?
Yeah.
I think that it's really important to understand when you say, is it going to be rate-based or is it going to be provided by somebody else, that we get to the very point that you're talking about there. We need long-term, for those of us who don't represent utilities and don't develop projects using rate base, where you have that long-term, ability to use financing that way. We depend upon certainty. We depend upon a stream of revenues with some level of certainty as to the amount of revenues that'll come in for a long enough time so that we can go to somebody who has money and borrow and use project financing to be able to do that. I think that whether you're talking about this project or the New York REV process that we've been talking about, I think that there's been an underappreciation of the need and the ability to get project financing into whatever it happens to be, whether it is a substation type of replacement alternative, or it's solar, or it's energy storage, or it's, you name it. It's across the types of technologies, the DERs that we're talking about. We're not yet getting the type of certainty and the type of revenue stream that will enable us to use other people's money. And if the development community, the direct energies, or the solar and energy storage providers aren't using project financing, that will default back to the rate base. Utility style.
So in the spirit of the debate this morning.
Sure. You wanted us to stir it up,
Yeah,
right?
let me engage with you on that, and certainly agree that long-term predictability or longer-term predictability is essential to project finance. And let me also suggest that particularly in the VBR proceeding, and I don't know how active you are in that, but those that are confronting the intersection of both what I describe as market responsive investment, a community distributed generation facility, and non-wires alternatives, which are looking to solve a particular problem. They each have different value propositions. They both require a degree of certainty. And this is where the challenge exists right now on how to provide that. And in fairness to the development community, particularly in the solar sector, moving from a paradigm of net metering to more market-based uncertainty that exists through the value of DER methodology has been a challenge, but the industry has stepped up, and I want to commend them for that. It hasn't been easy, There's certainly a lot of work to do, but people have worked at this. So you've identified a key topic for the next 12 to 18 months as we go into phase 2 of VDR. And if I could take out my magic REV wand, one of the things I'd like to see is to get the investment community, the people who provide that financing, more directly engaged. I had an occasion to go to a meeting shortly after the commission adopted its order back in March. And there were a lot of people from the financial community there, but none had really taken the time to read or to think, let alone participate. So I encourage you and your colleagues in this space to come. I also want to put a plug in for REV Connect, which you'll be hearing about later today, but REV Connect is designed in large part to provide the venue where business modeling can take place and problem solving around innovative business models can take place.
Scott, I agree in the investment community, but as a large corporate, we've got 2 new global business units, a distributed energy business unit and Internet of Things, Hive business unit, that we're investing hundreds of millions of pounds in. And that is focused in bringing capital to customers. We've bought a CHP business here that operates in the greater tri-state area, and we're looking to grow that business. So I'm completely, and I think there is capital from the corporates and from the investment community. I think the investment community will always start out in a place in project finance where they'll want more certainty. As we go forward, they'll be able to find value, and I think you're seeing that in the community solar business more and more here in New York and across the country. But I want to come back. I mean, I'll keep coming back to this point. Ultimately, you asked the question: how much of this market needs to be involved, right, in this conversation? And it's not 100%. And your parties maybe are different than my parties, maybe because I hang out with energy people when I go, which I don't know.
Sounds thrilling if you're REV all night.
And I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm going to just leave it at that. But I do think that the presumption that consumers are disinterested or not engaged, I think follows from a fact that for the longest period of time they had no control. I mean, the idea that I got a bill in September for my August usage, and there was one data point, which was a certain amount of kWh, that I don't even know, nobody knows what that means. And then there's this number at the bottom that I either have a choice of pay or not pay. Right, that was my option, right?
You really have an option?
Well, I mean, you do. I guess you have an option if you choose to, but to a world where you have customers engaging because they're getting information in a much more right-time fashion. I hate the term real-time because I don't think real-time, there's no such thing as real-time, there's only right-time. When they get that, they do become engaged. We see this in markets like Texas all the time. I mean, our customers that take a daily build product use 10% less energy than when normally situated customers. And I think that's the key. But you don't need 100% of the market to be on that product.
Right.
You need to let the customers express that preference of which product will work. And that's where I think, I'll come back, one of the things we can't have is that we fall back to there is only one supplier of all of these products across the market. I don't think Con Ed wants to be the only supplier. I think we need to make sure that whatever we do, we need to make sure there's an adequate number of thoughtful, capitalized suppliers that can engage with consumers, small and big, to go forward. And that, to me, has to be one of the principles of all of this transformation, is making sure we can have a true market, many buyers and many sellers.
So to get to that market, one of the things that we're going to need, obviously, is the market certainty to then build, the products that you're offering to different customers. And we sort of been skirting around the value of DER. I know that the most recent finding that came out, some solar groups were less than pleased. We'll say politely, they took issue with the calculations of by some of the utilities for marginal cost of service and some other figures in there. This is hard stuff, right? Most of the utilities generally don't have hosting capacity analyses on their different feeders. I mean, to get to these numbers that you want to do marginal cost of service for every little pocket, like it's a long time out. So I believe where we're at is that every 3 years, I think this is going to get updated, but the market wants 15 years of certainty to go for project finance. So let's dig into sort of where, you know, policy meets reality and moving this faster and faster while still providing enough market certainty for that long term. It's really, really difficult what everyone's trying to do. And it seems nearly impossible as I sit here 3.5 years in. You know, you talk about the next 12, 18 months. At what point are we 6, 8, 10 years in? And, you know, the market still can't grab onto it to get this, you know, to get that long-term project finance. And you talked about prioritization sequence, Scott, earlier. How's that being refined so that we do get to that place?
So I think the perspective of time becomes important. And without getting into all the details of MCOS studies, let's just say that there was general recognition that phase one was intended to be a series of compromises that recognized there was a lot more work to be done, but allowed to get a methodology implemented. For all sorts of reasons, there was some disagreement about substance, but I think there's also a forgetting about the process. And many of the things which the solar community wanted to do in terms of dissecting and challenging the MCOS studies, in fact, is going to take place in phase two where there is the time. The other thing is that those studies will be updated about every 3 years. They need to get aligned with the distribution system implementation plans, which is in the process of taking place. But that's only one element of the value stack. And the challenge for all of us is to recognize that the value stack has many components. There'll probably be some added to it in some years. Some of them will have greater certainty than others. And all this has to reflect the reality of the marketplace. So I go back to the challenge I mentioned, which is if a CDG project comes along and says, we want to locate here, I'm going to respond to some locational price signals I'm getting now, and I'm going to be here for 20 years, and I'm going to be providing value you can't even predict today, so I want that to be recognized. Meanwhile, the utility says, well, thank you very much. But as it turns out, the value we thought was there last year is no longer there for that element because the whole system has changed because of investment. So what we're looking to do is how do you balance that? And how do you do it in a way that allows capital to flow, that allows that investment to be made, not just for the sake of the investor, but to accomplish the public policy of the governor and others to see community distributed generation take place. There's a lot of work and effort going into that. In terms of the perspective of time, many of us in this room were here 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago, and it seemed like, if you listen to some of us that were speaking, Audrey, myself, and others, that it was going to happen in a snap, and that the track one order was going to be a big bang. I think if we look back now, we see a lot. Matt and his colleagues at Con Ed and the other utilities have heard many of my colleagues and I whine about the deployment schedule for AMI because AMI becomes a critical path technology in order to accomplish many of the prosumer empowering activities that we want. But I'm confident that when you come back next year, there'll be continued progress and some bumps. And if we come back 5 years, we'll see something different. My last point for this is we all have a tendency to talk about the market. I want to suggest that there are many markets. Some markets exist today, some are being actuated today. But the goal, as was mentioned previously, is to empower the consumer to engage in the transactions which they see value in. And that's going to be a very personal decision, but our collective job is to empower them.
Yeah, Todd, is that like a good enough answer for you?
Well,
Of course not.
I would say three things. The first one is that those of us who've been in the industry know that very often the first iteration becomes calcified into the permanent iteration. And there's some fear about that. We need to continue to evolve the values. The second thing is I think that there needs to be a more robust process in this phase two and beyond to actually pressing for the numbers, actually getting reality. And I'm not saying that the utilities, put up fake numbers or anything like that. I just don't think they're doing the best they can, but we can all do better to press on that through, I think, a more adjudicative type of a process to really press down, to really find out what the numbers are. The third thing I would say is that storage has been left out in a lot of aspects of what's going on here. And storage enables, storage creates mini markets. And so long as storage is left out of the conversation, we're not going to get to a more sophisticated level of hitting many levels in the stack.
Let me suggest that it's unfair to suggest that storage is left out of the conversation. The Commission spoke directly to storage in March. It created it as a priority. NYSERDA in general and the Green Bank in particular are developing targeted programs to help commercialize storage, or at least to be able to financially deploy storage in these early days. And I think you'll see a lot more coming out, and it is a high priority in the phase 2 VDR working groups. So there's a lot to be done, and I think there's no disagreement from anybody that storage is the order of the day.
Could we talk you into having some storage targets on a utility by utility basis?
You never know. But
I think that would really help.
But the issue is, and it's interesting, that on the one hand, and I'm not suggesting this, but on the one hand, there is a comment that we're relying too much on the utilities. We're allowing utilities to rate base too much. And for storage to really take off, for any technology to take off, you have to create the demand from the population in general. And we think that there's an opportunity to do both. But I think that we will miss the mark if we look at utilities as the sort of default purchaser of things. One of the disciplines we're trying to do inside DPS is not talk about utilities doing something, but rather recognizing that at the end of the day, it's ratepayers who are paying the bill. So going back to the comments of the solar industry, where one of the headlines was that the solar industry said that DPS or the PSC gave utilities a great victory. And I asked them, would you be willing to change that headline to say that the PSC gave ratepayers a great victory? And I say that because I think we have to remember the role of the ratepayer both as the source of the dollars, as well as ultimately the consumer that is going to make this whole portfolio of markets take off.
I mean, and I think that point has to be reiterated again and again and again. And I appreciate what Con Ed may think about this, but if the goal is to have a single buyer, utility a single buyer, which I don't think it is, right? But if it de facto becomes the goal, then you are going to naturally, my belief will be, you'll have less of the product, because the utilities will never find the incentives. And this whole world is about incentives, right? I mean, my biggest problem every day is that I have 3 teenagers and I can't get those incentives right. So setting the incentives for a utility, or even probably harder, but creating the right incentives so that we understand, and consumers understand that we're trying to create incentives for them to evolve their own energy demands and desires and wants. And I come back to Con Ed, because I think you could read a lot of the actions over time. It always seems to fall back that, let's get the utility to do this, let's get the utility. I don't think that's the DPS's goal, but it does sometimes come back. I don't know what Con Ed thinks, if that's their goal, to be the single buyer of all of these products over time.
Certainly not in the environment in New York State, certainly not.
Right.
I mean, there are different utility models and different regulatory models in different states, but to be clear, in New York, Con Ed of New York only procures 40% of the energy we deliver through our system. Our true role in this is to be the network provider. We do not produce energy. We distribute network energy across a network that's increasingly becoming bidirectional. So whether that energy is produced upstate at a hydro facility, a nuclear facility, or locally and moved across our distribution network, that is our role. We do have a view, as we move through this proceeding, towards what does the ultimate cost to ratepayers look like. And as we talk about things like what do our marginal cost studies look like, we do want to have a degree of certainty to those marginal cost studies, because those are studies really that looks at how much does it cost to expand our system to accommodate load growth. And we have seen in our service territory across the country a decoupling of economic growth from load growth. We're down to less than 0.5% load growth in a city that's growing by 2 and 3% GDP growth annually. So to try to lock in a marginal cost for a very long term, when likely peak load has flattened and may be declining, potentially puts a cost burden on consumers that we are concerned about, realizing this is a compromise around hitting both affordability numbers and also looking at policy objectives in the state. So it really is a balancing act. I don't envy Scott in his position trying to balance all these things out.
An underpinning that we shouldn't lose sight of REV is in fact changing the role of the utility.
Right.
And we talk about, the term has been used a lot, the distribution system platform provider. The utility is facilitator, network provider, another way of saying it. And folks will recall that there are three elements to that. There is a planning function, there's a system operation function, and there's a market administration function. By that we mean that the yet to be implemented dynamic transactive distribution level market. In terms of really geeky stuff that's going on, but important stuff, there are very active conversations that are taking place right now between the staff of the DPS, the staff of the joint utilities, and the New York Independent System Operator to understand how do you design that market, how do you adopt the role of the utilities into this role of a platform provider and a facilitator. What's the role of DPS? How do you make these markets function? We'll begin to see it, and the way I summarize it is those people who are active in the DER space know that there's a proceeding at the NISO that's looking at how do you integrate DER into the wholesale market structure that exists. We have an informal process going on, and we will be publishing our own roadmap soon. But we're looking at it and say, how do you create the market structure that will bring about the DER deployment that's required to get to the transactive market? It's an interesting juxtaposition, and all this has to be done in real time.
Yeah, I mean, just getting to that next step of talking about transactive markets at the distribution level and utilities sort of transformed into network providers is a whole other ball of wax, right, as we just try to get through the rounds of value DER proceedings.
But in the value of the VDR proceeding, the reason it exists is to lay the foundation to accomplish that. The drive towards more accurate, more precise pricing and valuation and compensation, of course, is a good unto itself. But without that, we were never going to get the DR deployment
Sure.
and the value recognition that again becomes an enabling step to all this.
So I'm going to jump to a couple questions. There's many good ones. Feel free to continue to upvote and add questions here. So this one came in before the panel even started and remains at the top, so we'll make sure to get to it. At last year's show, data availability for entrepreneurs about the grid and about customer demand was an issue, to put it politely. Any progress? So let's switch and talk about data availability, both from utilities on all levels and how that's going. It's a sticky point, not just here in New York and other places as well, in California. And when you talk about prioritization sequences, certainly that applies as well. And so I'd be curious from everybody here whether you feel you're sharing data at the speed that others are asking for it, if you're laying the groundwork to do that, and where the frustration points are, and is policy actually solving that?
Yes, no. The vehicle to accomplish that, principal vehicle, there's no one saying, is the DSIP planning process. And I think the first generation of DSIPs, one of their effectiveness was to illustrate how much work needs to be done in this area. I think that there is a general commitment on the part of utilities we've seen to provide the data. Sometimes we in utilities have asked some market participants, tell us precisely what data you need, and understand where they say, we want everything. And we want everything because in there are things that we'll be able to use, but we don't know how we can use it until we see it. I mean, it's a good faith ask, but it's still a broad, vague ask. So in order to try to refine that, the Commission asked the utilities to launch a stakeholder engagement process around the DSIPs, which has also been illustrative in its problems. And that's a topic of very active conversation. In fact, there's a meeting taking place later this week among senior staff of the utilities and DPS to get at that. Access to good data on a timely basis is critical. I think we all recognize it. We have to do better, and there's a commitment to do better.
Anybody else want to?
I'd agree, we need more information, and I would even agree on behalf of the technology, and the DER provider world, that we don't know exactly what we need.
Yep.
In part because we don't know where the markets are going, and we don't even know the technical, digital, information-based things that we can use. We're going that direction. We know we need to go that way, but we need to work with you. But more information is better than little and less, and it'll help markets go better.
I mean, Scott made this point earlier. One of the preconditions, I think, for 21st century energy economy is effective deployment of, for lack of a better term, smart meters, digital meters. I think we're seeing that in places like Texas, where you have CenterPoint, Encore, somebody that Houston and Texas had some issues recently with a big rainstorm. The utilities it's an amazing result, but they were able to inform consumers before the consumers even knew they were out. Because I was sitting there getting text messages from CenterPoint telling me when my power would be restored. I know that the distribution network was operating because as the power dropped, it would come back on in 2 minutes because they were rerouting and the circuits were able to reconnect. I don't know exactly what happened in Florida with Irma, a different environment because of the wind, but again, I think there was, the consumers were having to make phone calls, there was a lot of back and forth, which I don't know that utilities really want that. They want a digital environment. That is a first precondition, I think, and I would just say that any market that wants to evolve, any state that wants to evolve needs to have a firm commitment to that and accelerate the timeline around that. And the data that comes from that is the customer's data. And the customer, as we see it in places like Texas, retailers can manage the privacy, the security issues, which are more and more paramount to us, along with the utility partners. And I think that's a big goal, and I think it's an important step that people make that firm commitment across all of New York if they really want a reformed energy business here.
And from the utility standpoint for Con Ed, we are in the middle of that deployment. We think that is foundational, both from an information and operational standpoint, for how we can help both facilitate markets and improve the operation of the overall system and reduce costs for customers. I would agree that piece of information is absolutely foundational in how we do this.
Do you see sort of a change in thinking in Con Ed, just even since REV started, about system data that you will be sharing, moving forward as you get into hosting capacity and all of that? We've seen in different states and different places, some pushback about, what needs to be shared to get to other parties to build projects and understand that. And it seems like it's an evolution for the utilities in terms of what they feel comfortable sharing.
So we are committed to working with stakeholders to figure out what information they need to be able to facilitate the transaction with customers that they're looking for. That said, some of the asks through some of these stakeholder working groups have essentially been, give us all your data about all your customers and all your circuits and your forward-looking forecast 5 years out, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. Because we don't know what we're going to do with it, but we think we want it. And thinking about both the privacy concerns of customers who are not interested in participating and just the practical realities of developing that level of granular data, which typically for utilities does not exist today, particularly as kind of forecasts, because often energy usage is coupled directly to weather. And if you're asking me what the weather is going to be on September 4th, 2020 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, frankly, I don't know. So what is the right amount of information that is useful and that helps facilitate things and still continues to protect the privacy of customers who are not particularly interested? For example, many large C&I customers consider their usage data to be proprietary about how they operate their business, and they would not be comfortable with the utility sharing that openly and even masking it in ways that you might be able to figure out who they are if it's released publicly.
And really quickly, because many inquiring minds want to know here, is Con Ed applying any REV ideas to their gas distribution system? Specifically, are we going to see time of use pricing, any locational value on the gas system anytime?
So I think what we've learned in REV, the electric system, really what we've learned about the evolution of energy markets, we're applying across all of our businesses. To the degree we're looking at things like time of use pricing and locational pricing in gas, I don't think that's exactly there yet. I think the gas business and the electric business are similar in a lot of ways, but have some distinct differences. So applying some of what we learned, but not necessarily all right away.
Nope, is the short answer to that. And with that, we're out of time. I don't want to be the one to throw the entire day off schedule so early here. So if everyone could thank the panelists for being with me here today.